I never thought a single line on a bank statement could pull the floor from under me. There it was, a name I didn't recognize, buried between routine payments and quiet habits. Outside, the ocean pressed against the rocks, steady and indifferent, like it had been every day since Eleanor passed. I used to think gratitude was simple: give, receive, remember. But that morning in Harborville, I learned it can rot, quietly, beneath the surface of love. Stay close. Like and subscribe. The truth's just beginning to show. I wake up before the sun most days. Old habits die hard, I suppose. The house is quiet now, too quiet. I make coffee the way Eleanor used to like it, 2 sugars, 1 sigh. I sit by the window that faces the harbor, the fog rolling in like a secret. Out there, the fishermen are already working, pulling their living from the dark. I used to do the same, pull meaning from the quiet. That morning started like any other. I balanced the checkbook, went through the same motions I'd done for decades: numbers, deposits, small withdrawals. A few bills. Then it appeared, the line that didn't belong, a transfer to a name I didn't recognize. LCDM. At first I thought it might be a system error, a typo maybe, but something about it, about the way it sat there on the page, felt wrong. I leaned back in my chair, coffee cooling beside me, and tried to remember the last time Lucas had asked for help. It hadn't been long. Just a temporary setback, he'd said. You've always been there for us, Arthur. He had a way of saying it. Soft, grateful, like I was still needed, I still mattered. I suppose I liked hearing it. I was proud of that, you know, being useful, being the man who could still fix things, even after losing Eleanor. When Margaret and Lucas moved into the house after her mother died, I told myself it made sense. The house was too big for one man, and they needed a place. It was what family did. And Lucas, he'd saved Eleanor's life once, gave her part of himself quite literally. Bone marrow, 15 years ago, and I can still see the look on his face when the doctor told us it was a match. He smiled at me and said, "We're family now, sir." I meant it when I told him that our home would always be his too. Gratitude like that doesn't just fade. It roots itself in you, grows vines around your sense of fairness. It makes you believe you owe something, forever. But debts have a way of growing heavy, even when you don't notice. Margaret always said Lucas had too much pride for his own good. Back then I thought she was being unfair. He was trying. The world wasn't easy on men like him, men who lost their footing while their wives climbed higher. She got a promotion, and he got laid off. Timing can be cruel that way. I remember the arguments that filled the nights, words sharp enough to slice the quiet right out of the air. Sometimes I'd hear her crying in the kitchen, and I'd want to step in, but Lucas would always come to me later, calm, composed, a drink in his hand. "She doesn't understand, Arthur," he'd say. "You know what it's like to have the world look at you like you're less than what you used to be. And damn it, I did know. Maybe that's why I kept believing him. So I helped. First, small things. Groceries, gas money, a check just to get by. Then it became monthly, routine. I told myself it was fine. Family helps family. But sometimes, when I looked at Margaret, I'd see something colder in her eyes. A distance. She knew something I didn't, or worse, something I refused to see. The day I found that strange name on the bank statement, I tried to shrug it off. "Probably a clerical mix-up," I muttered. Still, I couldn't stop staring at it. I typed it into the search bar on my laptop, my hands shaking slightly. Nothing. Just initials, a ghost in the records. I thought of calling Lucas, but decided against it. I didn't want to sound paranoid. He'd probably laugh, call me old man like he always did. Said it affectionately, but it carried something else, something faintly mocking underneath. I folded the statement and tucked it back into the drawer, told myself I'd deal with it later. That's what I do best. Delay the pain until it stops knocking. But it didn't stop knocking that morning. Because that name, those letters, they stayed with me, echoing against the walls of my head as I watched the fog lift from the harbor. Harbourville was waking up, gulls crying overhead, fishermen returning with their first catches. I'd always loved that sound. It meant another day had begun, and maybe, just maybe, things would hold together. Only this time, I could feel it. The shift. The tiny fracture that comes before everything breaks. When I went out for groceries later that morning, I passed the bakery where Eleanor used to buy bread on Sundays. The scent of warm dough hit me, and for a second I was back there with her. Her laughter, her hands dusted with flour as she tore the loaf apart before we even reached the car. It's strange how grief can live inside smells, how it can sneak up on you between aisles of canned soup and cereal boxes. By the time I got home, Margaret had already left for work. Lucas's car was gone too. The house felt emptier than usual, though it was full of things, photos, trinkets, memories pretending to be home. I set the groceries down, made another pot of coffee, and sat at the same table, staring at that folded paper again. It wasn't about the money, it was about the feeling, that slow erosion of trust you can't quite name yet, the kind that eats away at your sleep before you know what's wrong. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the windows like restless fingers. Somewhere a loose shutter creaked. I reached for Eleanor's old shawl hanging on the chair and draped it over my shoulders. Funny how small comforts start to mean everything when you're alone long enough. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. That gratitude, not suspicion, had always guided me, but gratitude can blind a man just as easily as love. Sometimes they're the same thing, only one asks for something in return. The tide was coming in fast. I could hear it. The steady push and pull, the promise of change. I didn't know it yet, but that quiet morning was the last time I'd ever believed that helping someone couldn't hurt. And as I folded the statement once more, I caught my reflection in the window, half shadow, half memory. For a moment I didn't recognize the man looking back. He looked like someone about to learn the true price of gratitude. Harbourville teaches you to measure time by tides and hospital monitors. 15 years ago, I learned both at once. Eleanor's room smelled like iodine and peppermint tea. Machines hummed with the soft arrogance of things that believed they were keeping her alive. Margaret sat on the windowsill, pretending to work on her laptop, eyes red around the edges. Lucas paced. He was younger then, sharp jaw, earnest eyes, a jacket too thin for February. The doctor came in with that practiced neutrality and said the match had been confirmed. Lucas was it. He grinned at me like a boy granted a chance to prove he was a man. "We're family now, sir," he said, voice trembling just enough to be true. "Let me do this." I reached for his shoulder and felt the bones under the flannel. Fragile, brave. "You already did," I said, and meant it. Gratitude anchored itself in my chest like a mooring. That day, he gave Eleanor months she would not have had. We took those months and made them into small, stubborn holidays. We drove the coastal road with the windows cracked, winter air slicing our cheeks, while Eleanor sang along to the radio, off-key and glorious. When she finally slipped away, it was quiet, the kind of quiet that changes a house's grammar. Lucas stood beside Margaret at the funeral, his hand a knot around hers. After, in our kitchen, Eleanor's kitchen, steam rose from the casserole dishes neighbors had delivered with pity baked in. Lucas washed plates he didn't need to wash, and said it without being asked, "We can stay here a while, help you keep the place up." Margaret watched me with cautious hope. I said yes. It felt like the natural end to the pledge I'd made in a hospital corridor. Life thickened and then thinned. Routine replaced prophecy. Mornings began with Eleanor's shawl draped over the chair I refused to move. Margaret left early in a navy coat that meant ambition, coffee in a travel mug, hair in a determined knot. Lucas floated. He had jobs like minnows, quick and hard to hold. He made dinner some nights, oversalted stew, an apology in a bowl. He called me old man and arty and sometimes sir, depending on what he needed from me. There were good moments. I won't pretend there weren't. The three of us at the pier at dusk, Gulls heckling the last boats home. Margaret laughing at something small Lucas said. I took pictures of their backs against pink sky and told myself this was what surviving looked like. But relationships have weather too. Micro storms. The first was Margaret's promotion. She came home bright with the kind of relief success brings to daughters who've been told to be careful about wanting too much. Lucas poured her wine and kissed the top of her head. "To the new assistant manager," he said, smiling with all his teeth. That night, after she went to bed, he uncorked a second bottle and sat across from me. "You ever notice how they look at you different when you're the one between jobs?" He was joking mostly. I told him it would pass. Jobs came and went. Character stayed. He nodded like he agreed, and then didn't look at me for a while. Another storm. A winter power outage. We huddled in the living room with candles and blankets, breath visible, the house exhaling ghosts. Margaret read aloud from one of Eleanor's old paperbacks. Lucas interrupted with a story about a contractor who'd stiffed him. "You'd think people would respect hard work," he said, "but they only respect pay stubs." The way he said it landed in my chest with a dull tap. I tried to be ballast. I fixed a leaky faucet, changed a porch light, paid a bill that came with red lettering. When Lucas asked for a little help, just until unemployment clears, I reached for my checkbook the way some men reach for prayer. He thanked me with his whole face. It felt right, like tending a grave you love. Margaret began to work later. Some nights, I'd find her in the dark kitchen, not crying exactly, just pressed into silence. "You okay?" I'd ask. "I'm fine," she'd say, which is a word women use when the truth would blow the roof off. "Just tired." "Lucas is trying," I'd offer soft. "It's a hard time." She'd nod, and something in her would tighten, like thread pulled through cloth. "I know," she'd say, "someone is always trying." I didn't understand until much later how those sentences were already choosing sides for us. Sundays were still sacred. I made pancakes the way Eleanor liked them, with too much vanilla. Lucas would stand over the griddle with a spatula and an opinion. "You're burning them, Artie." He'd flip one onto my plate. Charred edges, sweet center. "Perfect," he'd say, and we'd eat and pretend nothing could crack the morning. Sometimes he'd bring me a beer on the back steps and talk about the men at the hardware store, how they'd given him a look when he said he was between gigs. "They don't know what it is to be a good man and still be unlucky," he said once, half daring me to contradict him. I didn't. I remembered being broke and proud, and how Eleanor had held the roof up with grace. "You'll land," I told him. "You're not the missing kind." When Margaret got her second promotion, the air changed temperature. Lucas tried to celebrate her, but I saw the way his jaw set as she listed new responsibilities. He didn't say anything cutting, not then. He waited until the dishes were done. Then, in the doorway to the hall, he tossed it over his shoulder like a scarf. "Must be nice." I caught his arm gently. "Pride will starve you faster than hunger," I said. He smiled as if I'd told a charming lie. "You'd be surprised what pride can feed, old man." On weekdays, I kept the house, walked the harbour, spoke to the same 3 shop owners who still remembered Eleanor by name. I paid bills. I learned to like the mechanical kindness of autopay. I gave when asked. And when I wasn't asked, I offered. Gratitude isn't just memory, it's a discipline. Once, bad timing took Lucas's voice over the edge. He came home smelling like a bar that had given up and said, "You know what she called me?" Her dependent. He cracked the word like a knuckle. In front of her boss, Art, dependent. I doubted the context, but I believed the bruise. "She's stressed," I said. Words slip. "Not that one," he replied and poured himself a drink that did not need pouring. Later, in bed, the house held its breath. I lay awake and listened to Harbourville's small map of sounds, distant buoy bells, wind thumbing the clapboard, the heater coughing itself honest. Beside those ordinary noises, there was a newer sound, a careful, practiced distance between 2 people down the hall. I told myself we would be okay, that families were harbours. Boats left, Boats returned, and sometimes they sank. But the water kept holding the shape of them. It comforts me now to remember that I believed that. It means I wasn't born suspicious. I had to be taught. It's strange how silence can build a shape in a house. You start to recognize its outlines, the gap between footsteps, the pause before someone answers. By the following spring, the silence had grown a spine. I could hear it move. Lucas was out of work for 6 months by then. The unemployment checks had stopped coming, and the optimism that used to live in his voice had gone missing too. He'd started keeping a beer beside his morning coffee. When I'd ask if everything was all right, he'd smile and say, "Just keeping the hands steady, old man." The smile didn't reach his eyes. Margaret kept longer hours at the firm. Her voice on the phone shifted from warm to clipped, efficient. She was building a career while the rest of us were treading water. I admired her, but Lucas took her success as a bruise. He hid it behind jokes. "She's the boss at home and at work," he'd say, laughing just enough to hide the resentment. At first, I thought it was just wounded pride. Every man feels that sting once in a while, but it became sharper. He started measuring himself against her shadow, and no one wins that kind of war. One night, I came home from a short walk by the harbour and found them arguing in the kitchen. It wasn't the words I remember, but the rhythm. Short, fast, overlapping. Margaret's hands were trembling as she tried to explain something, a job dinner maybe. Lucas's voice was low, a growl under his breath. When he saw me, he stopped mid-sentence and forced a smile. "Hey, old man, we were just talking." She left the room, the sound of her heels cutting through the quiet. Lucas poured himself a drink he didn't need. "You ever feel like the world's trying to humiliate you?" he asked. "No," I said. "The world's too busy. We humiliate ourselves." He didn't like that. The glass clinked hard on the counter. "You think she's right, don't you? You think I'm the problem." "I think," I said carefully, "you're hurting, and when people hurt, they make noise." He stared at me, eyes bright with alcohol. "You've always taken her side." "That's not true," I said, though maybe it was, in small, unspoken ways. He took a long breath. "Art, you're the only one who still believes in me. At least someone does." That line, "You're the only one," it hooked itself deep. That night, I convinced myself I was the bridge holding our family steady. I didn't see I was already being walked across. The money talk came weeks later, subtle at first, a loan, a favor. I didn't mind. Gratitude has muscle memory. Helping Lucas felt like helping Eleanor all over again. Maybe that's what made it easy to say yes. The first check was for a school expense, then medical costs. I didn't question it. He'd always sound a little embarrassed, which made me want to ease his burden. "You've done enough for us," he'd say. "I'll pay you back soon." I'd wave it off, pretending generosity came without conditions. Margaret noticed before I did. She found a receipt one night, a withdrawal I hadn't mentioned. "Dad," she said quietly, "are you giving Lucas money again?" "Just a little," I said. "He's looking for work." Her jaw tightened. "He's been looking for work for a year." I hated the way she said it, like compassion was naive. "You don't understand, Maggie. He's trying." She looked at me, tired. "That's what he tells you?" That conversation stayed between us, unspoken but heavy. I kept helping him, and she kept pretending she didn't know. Families survive on small hypocrisies. But guilt has a way of changing temperature in a house. You can feel it in the air, smell it in the meals. The warmth we used to share began to curdle. Lucas started spending more time running errands. He'd come home late, his stories rehearsed. Margaret stopped asking. One Saturday morning, she went to visit a client in Portland. Lucas sat across from me at breakfast, eyes dull, voice slow. "You ever think about starting over, Art? Really starting over? Starting over how?" He shrugged. "Different job, different town, different life." "You've got one here," I said. "You just have to fix it." "Maybe it's not mine to fix," he said quietly, and changed the subject. It should have scared me, that sentence. Instead, I thought he was just venting. But there was a flicker there, one I didn't recognize yet, a man measuring how far he could go before disappearing. That afternoon, I caught him using my computer. He said he was updating his resume, but the screen went dark too quickly when I walked in. I didn't ask. I didn't want to turn trust into accusation. That's the trouble with love. It makes you polite when you should be awake. By summer, things had calcified into something quieter but colder. We no longer argued. We just existed. Lucas still called me old man, but there was a different tone in it now, half jest, half pity. Sometimes when Margaret and I talked about the past, he'd leave the room, muttering something about living museums. I started writing letters to Eleanor again, the way I did in the first months after she died. Not to send, of course, just to talk. I'd tell her about the house, the small cracks in the plaster, the way the harbour sounded at dawn. I told her Margaret was thriving and Lucas was figuring things out. Lies have mercy in them sometimes. The day I mailed my property taxes, I caught Lucas watching me from the hallway. He smiled faintly. "Still paying the bills, huh?" "Someone has to," I said, keeping it light. He nodded almost respectfully. "You're a good man, Arthur." It sounded like a eulogy. Later that week, Margaret left for a work conference. Lucas said he'd handle dinner. I came home to the smell of overcooked pasta and an opened bottle of bourbon. We sat across from each other, silent except for the wind against the windows. Then he said, "Do you ever feel like life owes you something?" I looked at him, really looked. "No," I said. "I think it's the other way around." He laughed once, sharp and bitter. "Maybe that's why you're still decent." When I went to bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in him had closed. Like a door, gently, permanently. The next morning, I checked my account balance online, just routine. Everything looked fine, for now. By the time fall rolled into Harbourville, the air smelled of salt and wood smoke. The leaves burned red along the roads, a beauty that hurt to look at. Change always comes dressed like that here. Quiet at first, then absolute. Lucas had taken to walking the harbour at night. Sometimes I'd hear the door close at odd hours, his boots thudding against the porch. He said it helped him think. Margaret said it helped him avoid her. I stayed out of it. The house was already thin with tension. Any more words might have torn it apart. But silence breeds invention. You start to fill the gaps with stories. Hers was that he was cheating. His was that she'd stopped caring. Mine was that I could fix it. I was wrong on all counts. I remember one Sunday evening vividly. The three of us sat at dinner. Margaret talked about a new account her firm had landed, a big one, maybe even a promotion. Lucas kept nodding, smiling at the right times, but his eyes were on his plate. "That's great, Maggie," he said finally. "Guess I'll start calling you boss, too." She laughed softly, but it didn't reach her face. After dinner, she went upstairs to take a call, and Lucas lingered. He poured himself a drink, then one for me. "You ever feel," he said, "like you gave everything to the wrong people?" I looked at him. "You mean Margaret?" He shook his head, but didn't answer right away. "Just people, life. You give, and they still look at you like you owe them." There was something venomous under his calm. "You sound tired," I said. He chuckled. "Yeah, I'm tired of being the charity case in my own home." Before I could speak, he left the glass half full and went out into the night. The door shut, like punctuation. That week, Margaret found an envelope on the kitchen counter. It was empty, but her name was written on the front, in Lucas's handwriting. She brought it to me, confused. "You think this means something?" I turned it over, pretending calm. "Maybe he meant to leave a note and forgot." She frowned. "He's been different, Dad. Distant." I wanted to tell her I'd noticed too, but something in me resisted taking sides. "It'll pass," I said. "Everything does." But not everything does. Some things just change form. Lucas started talking about money again. Just a little more to get through this month, he'd say, voice soft, grateful, like a man confessing rather than asking. I'll pay you back when the job comes through. Each time I believed him less but said yes anyway. Gratitude can be a stubborn illness. Margaret didn't say much, but I could feel her disappointment pulsing through the house. I'd catch her looking at me with something between pity and anger. You're not responsible for him, she told me once quietly. I made a promise, I said. To Mom, she replied. Not to him. That shut me up. The weeks bled together. I started to notice things I hadn't before. Calls Lucas took outside, a faint trace of perfume that didn't belong to Margaret, a story that changed from one telling to the next. He became restless, a man orbiting some secret. Then came the lie I couldn't unhear. It was late. I couldn't sleep. I walked past the living room and heard his voice, low but urgent. Of course I sent it. He doesn't suspect a thing. A pause, then softer. Don't worry, baby. We'll figure it out. I froze. There was the sound of a lighter flicking, the faint laugh that followed. He hung up quickly when the floor creaked under my foot. The next morning he acted as if nothing had happened. Morning, old man, he said, frying eggs like the world hadn't shifted overnight. I watched him move. Too relaxed, too normal. The same way you watch a calm sea that's hiding a rip current. I didn't say anything to Margaret. I told myself I needed proof, something solid, a name, a face, a reason not to believe in him anymore. That proof came sooner than I expected. A few days later, I went to the bank to renew a CD account. While the clerk printed my documents, I asked, almost casually, about the recurring transfer to LCDM. The woman frowned and clicked through the records. That's been going on for a while, she said. Same amount, same date every month. Is that yours? It's my account, yes, I said slowly, but I didn't authorize it. She nodded carefully. We can flag it for review if you'd like. Not yet, I said. Just print the details. When she slid the paper across the counter, the name was there in full. Lauren Cole DeMarco. My throat tightened. I didn't know her, but something about the neatness of the letters made me sick. I folded the paper, thanked her, and walked out into the cold. The harbour wind hit like truth. That night, I sat by the window, the paper on my lap. Margaret was upstairs, Lucas at a meeting. The house hummed with absence. I stared at that name until it blurred. I thought about calling him, confronting him. But then I remembered his eyes, the way they could turn any accusation into pity. Instead, I poured myself a drink I hadn't earned and whispered into the empty room. Eleanor, what have I done? The tide outside was high, the sound of it steady and merciless. I didn't know it then, but the fracture had finally become a fault line. The night the truth broke open didn't announce itself. It came disguised as another evening in Harborville, quiet, cold, unremarkable, the kind of night when the ocean forgets to whisper. Margaret had gone to visit a client out of town. Lucas said he'd stay home, maybe watch the game. I made dinner for two as usual. He never showed. The pasta dried out in the pot. The house smelled faintly of burnt garlic and unease. By 10, I started to worry. Not for him exactly, but for what his absence might mean. When you live long enough, you learn to hear the shape of a lie. I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. At 1:23 a.m., headlights swept across the window. The door opened quietly. He moved through the house like someone trying not to exist. I waited until he poured himself a drink before I spoke. Long night? He flinched, but recovered fast. Just needed air. Air doesn't smell like perfume, I said. He froze, glass mid-air. For a moment, I saw the boy who'd once saved Eleanor's life, the fear, the sincerity, but it was gone as quickly as it came. You've been checking up on me now, old man? Just on my bank account. He set the glass down hard. You've got no idea what you're talking about. Then tell me, I said. Who is she? He exhaled slowly, smirked, and looked past me as if the answer was somewhere behind my shoulder. You wouldn't understand. Try me. He turned then, really turned, eyes raw, voice low. You think she's some gold digger? She's not. She respects me. She doesn't look at me like I'm a broken project. Maggie. He stopped himself, jaw tightening. Maggie made me feel like nothing. Lauren makes me feel like a man. The room went very still. The clock ticked once. You've been taking money from me, I said, to fund your affair. He laughed, bitter and unsteady. Oh, don't make it sound so ugly. You wanted to help. You were always the generous one. Something inside me, something I'd spent years protecting, cracked. You used me, Lucas. He took a step closer. No, I survived. There's a difference. I could feel my pulse in my throat. You came into my home after I lost Eleanor and made yourself a son to me. And he cut me off, voice sharp. You needed me as much as I needed you. Don't rewrite history, old man. You wanted to be the hero. I just played my part. The words landed like stones. He turned to leave, muttering, I'm done explaining myself. The door slammed and the house felt hollow again. I sat there for hours, the paper with Lauren's name still on the table. Outside, the harbour lights flickered in the mist. I thought of Eleanor, her soft certainty that goodness always came back around. I wanted to believe that still. But goodness, like tide, sometimes retreats and doesn't return. By morning, Margaret was home. She found me at the table, same chair, same cold coffee. Dad, what happened? I handed her the paper. She read it once, twice, then pressed her hand to her mouth. Oh my God. He's been lying to us for years, I said. My voice surprised me, flat, almost calm. She sat down, shaking her head. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to believe I married someone like that. You didn't, I said softly. He became that. We spent the day in silence, moving around the house like ghosts who didn't know they were dead. She went through her phone, reading old messages with new eyes, each one cut a little deeper. By late afternoon, she packed a small bag. I'm staying with Emily tonight, she said. I need space. I nodded. Do what you need. When she left, I stood by the window and watched her car disappear down the narrow road. The fog swallowed it whole. I felt the kind of loneliness that sits inside your bones and waits. 2 days later, Lucas came back. Not contrite, not scared, angry. You told her, he said. She's my daughter, I replied. You ruined everything. His voice cracked. She was all I had. I laughed once without humor. Then you should have treated her like it. He paced the room, fists tightening, loosening. You think you're some kind of saint, don't you? You think because you sign checks and keep your dead wife's picture on the mantel that makes you better. I think it makes me decent, I said. He stopped pacing. You never understood. You never had to watch people look at your wife like she saved you. I stared at him. You were saved, Lucas. Twice. Once in that hospital, and once every time we forgave you. Something flickered across his face. Shame, maybe, but it hardened fast. You don't get to judge me, he said. You don't know what it's like to be the disappointment. Don't I? I whispered. He turned away, grabbed his coat, and left again. The door slammed so hard, the picture of Eleanor tilted on the wall. I didn't fix it. That night, I went through my files, my accounts, my documents. For the first time, I looked at everything not as memory, but as evidence. There were patterns I'd ignored, small withdrawals, forged digital signatures, details too deliberate to be accidents. He hadn't just lied to me. He'd stolen from me, quietly, repeatedly. The discovery hollowed me out. But beneath the anger, there was a strange calm. Like standing in the eye of a storm, you finally understand. The next morning, I called Frank Dawson, an old friend from my teaching days, now a lawyer. He came over with coffee and a briefcase that looked older than either of us. I told him everything. He didn't interrupt, just listened, his brow furrowing deeper with every detail. When I finished, he set his cup down. "Arthur, you've got grounds for a full report. Fraud, maybe even identity misuse. But are you sure you want to go that far?" I looked out the window. The tide was low, exposing the rocks beneath. "I'm sure," I said. "He took enough. He doesn't get to take my piece, too." Frank nodded. "Then we start today." By nightfall, the paperwork had begun, quiet, methodical, unstoppable. I didn't tell Margaret. Not yet. I needed her to breathe again first. When I lay in bed that night, the house felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but steadier, like the foundation had remembered what it was built for. I closed my eyes and whispered to the empty room, "It's over, Eleanor." But it was only changing shape. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes after a house has heard too much. It's not peace, it's vacancy. In the mornings the kettle still clicks, the radiators still cough, the gulls still circle like arguments that refuse to land, but everything sounds a step farther away, like I'm living on the other side of glass. Margaret stayed with a friend. She texted once, "I'm safe. Please eat," and then fell into a silence I didn't know how to break without making it worse. Lucas vanished into his new weather. I kept expecting a door to open, a footstep, a voice calling from the hallway. Nothing came. The day after Frank left with the folder of copies, I started gathering the originals, receipts, statements, the printouts I'd once folded like prayers. I spread them across the dining table, Eleanor's old floral runner beneath numbers that had learned how to lie. The afternoon light took its time. I read each line as if the paper might confess. I didn't tell the neighbors. Harborville is generous with casseroles and stingy with rumors only when you give it instruction. I wasn't ready to teach anyone what had happened to us. So I waved, I nodded, I bought my bread, I came home early. Shame makes you hungry and robs your appetite at the same time. I learned to drink water a little slower and call it lunch. At night I wrote to Eleanor again. The first letter was a confession. The second was a plea. The third was just a list, the brand of bourbon he'd started to prefer, the day he first asked for a monthly transfer, the exact angle of Margaret's jaw when she tried not to cry. I sealed none of them. The truth didn't need an envelope, it needed air. The house thinned. Without Margaret's heels and Lucas's muttered commentary, the rooms held a raw echo. Every sound had origin and consequence. A spoon against a cup, still drinking, the porch settling, winter coming, the phone on the table, no one calling. I moved slower, not because I was tired, but because speed implied urgency, and I had to admit I was adrift. I tried church the next Sunday, sat in the back near the coats, where old men go to agree quietly with God. The pastor spoke about Jonah and second chances. I wanted to stand and ask, how many chances make a coward? I didn't. After the service, Mrs. Reed pressed her hand over mine and asked after Margaret. "Working hard," I said, which was true and not true, and isn't that the shape of most answers? On Tuesday I walked the long loop by the harbour, past the cannery, past the bait shop, under a sky so pale it looked like it had run out of blue. Salt sharpened the air. A teenager skated by with earbuds and mercy, paying me no mind. I envied him his ignorance of my name. I wanted that anonymity again, the kind you get before you become the person who failed to protect his home. Back at the house, I stood in the doorway of the room Margaret and Lucas had shared and stared at the bed like it could explain itself. The sheets were neat. The nightstand held a glass ring. On the dresser, a loose screw I'd promised to fix months ago waited without accusation. I tightened it now with a coin. Some repairs arrive too late to matter, but you do them anyway, so your hands remember usefulness. Hunger came in waves, not for food, though some afternoons I forgot to eat until the light went wrong, but for sound. I missed the undercurrent of someone else existing beside me. I missed being annoyed by the television too loud, the cabinet left open, the shoes abandoned near the door like stubborn animals. Loneliness has a sense of humor. It returns you to the very grievances you thought you wanted to escape. One evening, a storm rolled up the coast and shook the windows like a debt collector. I brewed tea and opened the box of old photos. Eleanor at the pier, hair reckless. Margaret at 10, missing a front tooth, smiling like defiance. Lucas at Thanksgiving, carving a turkey with exaggerated seriousness while I photographed the joke. I pressed my thumb to that image until the paper warmed. "When did you turn?" I asked the man in the picture. "Was it gradual for you too?" The power flickered, then steadied. I lit 2 candles anyway. The house looked gentler by firelight. Less honest, maybe, but kinder. I took the stack of bank printouts and fed them to the flame one by one, not as denial, but as right. The smoke smelled like ink in the last few years. The ash gathered like snowfall that couldn't decide whether to land. Frank called with updates in sentences that had corners. "We're filing preliminary notices," he said. "Digital signature logs look promising." He asked how I was, in the way a man asks when he knows there isn't a useful answer. "I'm eating," I lied. He didn't argue. I started volunteering at the library 3 afternoons a week, reshelving returns, mending book spines with a delicate tape that didn't announce its presence. A teenager asked if I'd ever read Moby Dick. "Once," I said. "It's a book about obsession that insists it's about a whale." She laughed and checked it out anyway. The small usefulness steadied me. Books don't betray you. They reveal you, but only on terms you both agree to. Nights were the worst. That's when the house remembered everything. I lay awake and catalogued the betrayals, then catalogued the kindnesses so I wouldn't drown. Lucas had helped me fix the back steps once, whistling off-key. Margaret had bought me a wool hat, shaped like apology, the winter after Eleanor died. I let both lists stand beside each other until they stopped arguing. One morning, 3 weeks into the quiet, a letter arrived addressed to the Eleanor Foundation, an entity that didn't yet exist beyond signatures and intention. The envelope was from a community clinic up the coast, a place Eleanor had once donated to. They were holding a fundraiser, the polite kind that assumes you can still afford generosity. I set it on the mantel, beneath her photo. "Soon," I told her, "I'll make something out of this mess. Not noise, structure." The tide chart said low at 6:42 p.m. I walked to the rocks and stood on the newly revealed earth. It's ugly down there. Seaweed, broken shell, the wet truth of what holds the harbour up. I breathed until the cold made a point of itself. A gull shrieked like a laugh. The horizon wore its thin line of light. "All right," I said to no one, to everyone. "I'm still here." Coming home, I passed 2 boys throwing a football in a side street. One called, "Mister, want a turn?" I shook my head and kept walking, then stopped, turned, and held my hands out. The ball thumped my chest. I threw it back, poorly, and they cheered like I'd done something miraculous. For 10 seconds, I wasn't the man who had been deceived. I was a pair of living arms in a cold town at dusk. That night, I ate a real dinner. Chowder from the freezer that tasted better than the label promised. I washed the bowl and set it drying, a small example of completion. I sat at the table and wrote Eleanor one more letter. "They left," I wrote, "but I didn't. The house is empty but not abandoned. I'm learning the difference." Outside, somewhere in the dark water, a bell buoy kept time for me. The sound was steady, almost indifferent. I took comfort in its refusal to empathize. Pity is temporary. Rhythm is a kind of faith. The next morning I made a list with verbs: review, transfer, protect, call, and at the bottom a quieter one: breathe. I taped it to the fridge like a prescription. I didn't know it then, but the solitude had done its work. It had starved me of noise until only the necessary remained, and the necessary, I was about to learn, could be built. The first real morning of change came without announcement. No thunder, no sign. Just light finding its way through the curtains, warmer than it had any right to be. I made coffee and didn't flinch at the silence. That was new. The paperwork for the Eleanor Foundation had gone through. Frank called to confirm the filing. "Congratulations," he said, the way someone does when they're afraid to sound proud for you. I thanked him, hung up, and stared at the folder on the table. It was real now. A structure made out of everything that had fallen apart. The foundation would fund scholarships for local nurses, small grants for caregivers, maybe one day a hospice wing with Eleanor's name on it. It felt right. Reparation turned into rhythm. It didn't erase what had happened, but it gave the pain a job. I started taking long walks to the old pier where Eleanor and I used to sit with coffee in paper cups, watching the fog lift like a curtain. It was mid-March, the season when Maine remembers the idea of spring, but doesn't commit to it yet. The air still bit at my hands. The sea still looked older than forgiveness. One afternoon, a familiar voice called behind me. "Mr. Hale?" It was Jenny Reed, the pastor's daughter, now a nurse at the same hospital where Lucas once saved Eleanor. Time folds that way in small towns. "Heard you started something new," she said. I nodded. "Trying to." She smiled, that careful kind of smile people give when they know your story, but don't want to say it aloud. "My mom says you were a teacher once." "Still am," I said. Only the lessons changed. We stood in comfortable quiet, listening to the harbor's pulse. She told me about her patience, the exhaustion, the small miracles. Her voice carried that soft certainty I remembered from Eleanor's, the sound of someone who believes help still matters, even when it hurts. That night I filled out the foundation's first donation form in her name. $50. It wasn't much, but it was movement. Days blurred again, but differently now. Purpose filled the hours where regret used to live. I fixed the porch railing, painted the fence, sent letters to 3 old students who'd gone into medicine. Each envelope carried the same note. "If you ever need support, the Eleanor Foundation will be there." For the first time in months, the house began to sound like a home again. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, it all found a rhythm that matched my breathing. Then, one evening, as I was closing the curtains, I saw a car parked across the street. A grey sedan, engine idling. My stomach tightened. Lucas. He sat there for a while before getting out, hands deep in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. I opened the door before he could knock. "Arthur," he said, voice low, eyes darting everywhere but at me. "You shouldn't be here," I replied. "I just need to talk. There's nothing left to say." He looked thinner, unshaven, tired in a way that no sleep could fix. "I'm not here for money," he said quickly. "I swear." "Then what do you want?" He hesitated. "I lost her. Lauren, she's gone. Took what was left of the account and disappeared." I waited for the wave of satisfaction that should have come. It didn't. Only a strange ache. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. He laughed bitterly. "You? Sorry? You ruined me." "I didn't ruin you, Lucas. You did that yourself." He stepped closer. "You think you're righteous, don't you? Sitting in this house, turning your pain into charity. You're just as proud as I ever was." "Maybe," I said, "but I learned to build with mine." He stared at me for a long moment, eyes flickering with something I couldn't name. Rage, grief, maybe both. Then he said, "You don't have to report me. You can still stop this." "The papers are already filed," I said. "The law will decide what's fair now." His jaw clenched. "And if I asked you, as family?" "You stopped being family when you lied to protect your pride." For a second, he looked like he might cry or hit something or both. Then he turned, muttered something under his breath and left. The door closed softly this time. I stood there, listening to the quiet he left behind. It didn't hurt the way it used to. It was a cleaner silence, almost honest. The next morning I called Frank. "He came by," I said. "Did he threaten you?" "No," I said. "He just wanted to remind me why this matters." Frank sighed. "We'll let the system work. You just stay steady. Steady." That word followed me all day. I said it out loud when I mailed the next batch of foundation letters. I said it again while making dinner, When the loneliness pressed too close, I said it like a prayer. Steady, steady, steady. Weeks passed. The court process crawled forward. Slow, impersonal, necessary. Margaret called once, then again, each time sounding stronger. She said she'd come by soon. I told her to take her time. One morning, a package arrived. Inside was a framed photograph of Eleanor at the pier, smiling into the wind. Margaret had written on the back, "For the Foundation's office, when it becomes real." I set it on the mantel for now. Outside, the tide was coming in, higher than usual, covering the rocks where I used to stand and measure loss. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to count. I just watched the water rise and thought, this is what rebuilding looks like. Not a wave, a return. The weeks leading to the hearing moved like winter itself, slow, deliberate, biting. Every morning I walked to the pier, watched the fishermen cast their lines into grey water, and thought about how faith sometimes looks exactly like repetition. Frank kept me updated in short, clean sentences. Documents verified. Depositions next Thursday. Stay available. The tone of a man who had learned that justice is less about passion and more about patience. Margaret started visiting again. The first time, she stood in the doorway as if waiting for permission to exist there. I smiled and stepped aside. "You don't have to knock," I said. Her eyes glistened. I didn't know if I should. "You always should," I said, and that was all it took. She began coming every Sunday. We cooked small meals, watched the sea, avoided talking about Lucas. But his name lived between us like weather, unspoken, unavoidable. One Sunday, as we were drying dishes, she said quietly, "They served him, didn't they?" I nodded. "A week ago. Has he called you?" "Once," I said. I didn't pick up. She nodded, lips pressed tight. "He'll try to make you feel guilty." "I already feel guilty," I admitted, "just not for the reason he thinks." She put the towel down and looked at me. "You didn't do anything wrong, Dad." "Didn't I?" I asked. "I taught him gratitude meant never asking questions. Maybe I taught him how to hide." She shook her head. "You taught him how to be loved. What he did with that isn't yours to carry." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows like punctuation. The next few days blurred together. The lawyer called with schedules. I signed papers, mailed letters, waited. Harborville shrank around me in the waiting. Each corner of the town held a piece of our story. The bank, the bakery, the church pew where I first realized Grace could ache. Then came the envelope. It arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, a plain manila folder with my name written in blue ink. Inside was a single page, Lucas's statement to the court. I wasn't supposed to see it yet, but Frank thought I should be prepared. It began like an apology and ended like an accusation. He wrote that he'd made mistakes, that he'd felt small and overlooked, that he only took what he thought was owed. No mention of Eleanor, no mention of Margaret. Just me, described in past tense, as though I were already gone. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and slid it back into the envelope. I didn't feel anger, not even sadness, just a long, clean fatigue. The kind that settles in after a storm leaves, but before the sun remembers to show up. That night I walked to the harbor with a flashlight and a purpose I didn't yet understand. The tide was halfway in, the air cold enough to sting. I thought about everything gratitude had cost me, and then I thought about what it had given back. Clarity, structure, the small, stubborn piece of surviving your own mistakes. When I turned to head home, I saw headlights approaching. A car slowed near the pier, stopped and idled. It was Lucas. He rolled the window down. His face was drawn, beard uneven, eyes sleepless. "You going somewhere?" he asked. "Just walking," I said. He looked at the water. "You really gonna let them drag me through court?" "I didn't drag you anywhere," I said. "You walked there yourself." He slammed his hand against the steering wheel. "You think this fixes anything? You think putting me in a cell makes you the hero?" "I'm not trying to be a hero," I said quietly. I'm trying to be done." The words hung in the cold between us. He stared at me a long moment, then laughed, a sharp, broken sound. "You know what's funny? You still talk like you're the father I never had." "Maybe that's the problem," I said. He looked away, nodding to himself. "They're going to ruin me, Art. Everything I've got left." "I didn't take those things from you," I said. "You gave them away." He opened his mouth like he might argue, then stopped. For the first time in months, he looked small again, almost human. "I never meant to hurt her," he said finally. "I believe you," I said. "But you did." The engine idled. I could hear the waves chewing at the rocks. He took a deep breath and whispered, "I wish you'd never met me." I stepped closer to the car window. "I don't," I said, "because now I know the difference between saving someone and losing yourself doing it." He stared at me another second, eyes wet but defiant, then shifted into gear and drove away into the fog. I stood there until the sound of the engine faded, the air heavy with salt and something else, release maybe. When I got home, I sat at the table and wrote a single line on a piece of paper. Mercy isn't forgetting. It's remembering without surrendering. I folded it and placed it inside the Eleanor Foundation folder, a note to myself, a reminder of what still mattered. Outside, the foghorn sounded steady as breath. The next tide was coming, and with it, the reckoning. The courthouse in Portland smells like paper and winter. Frank met me on the steps with a nod that meant we were past pep talks. "Steady," he said, as if the word could button my coat all the way up. Inside, the hearing room was smaller than I expected. No grand drama, just a tired clock and a few rows of benches. Margaret slipped in beside me, her hand a warm weight on my sleeve. Across the aisle, Lucas sat alone. His beard had grown in patchy. He looked like a man who had been out in bad weather too long and learned nothing from it. Names were called, motions were stated. The judge spoke in a voice that didn't indulge feelings. Frank rose when it was our turn, his file neat enough to shave with. He laid out the transfers, the forged digital authorizations, the dates that marched in a rhythm only guilt could keep. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. When it was my turn, I stood with the knowledge that a life can be weighed by numbers, but not measured by them. The court swore me in. The air felt thinner. I looked at the judge, then at the back wall, and told the truth. "I helped my son-in-law because he once helped us," I began. "He donated marrow to my wife Eleanor 15 years ago. We were grateful. Gratitude became habit. Habit became permission." I let the words settle. I didn't see the line cross until the money had memorized it. I said it straight. The monthly transfers, the lies about school and medical bills, the afternoon at the bank when the initials became a name. Lauren Cole DeMarco. The room didn't react. Justice doesn't gasp. I explained how the signatures were executed from my devices while I was at the library or the pier, how forgiveness had made me lazy and blindness had called itself love. Frank asked one more question I wasn't prepared for. "Mr. Hale, do you still care for the defendant?" The room tilted. I could feel Margaret turn toward me. Lucas stared openly for the first time. "Yes," I said. "I care enough to stop confusing care with rescue." Lucas flinched like I'd thrown something. For a moment, I saw the boy from the hospital again. Then the mask returned, a tired swagger, a smirk that never reached his eyes. His attorney called him next. The man did what men like him do, tucked a ragged story inside tidy sentences. Lucas spoke about losing work, about the humiliation of being the dependent, about the way success can make a woman's love feel conditional. He didn't say Margaret's name, he said mine often, as if I were a concept more than a person. "Arthur understood," he repeated. "Arthur wanted to help. Arthur said family comes first." When Frank cross-examined, the room cooled. "Mr. Miller, can you explain this transfer on a night you claim you were at home watching the game?" He slid over a printout. Because Mr. Hale's phone GPS places him at a fundraiser at the church during that hour. Lucas blinked. I must have mixed up the dates. Can you explain why? The authorization on this transfer came from an IP address registered to a coffee shop in Scarborough, where Ms. DeMarco works, according to her public social profile. Another page slid. Another thread pulled. Lucas opened his mouth and closed it. His lawyer touched his elbow. The touch meant breathe. Lucas chose to burn. You think you're clever, he hissed. All of you. You're going to make me the villain because I refuse to be humiliated. Frank's voice didn't rise. No, Mr. Miller, the facts will do that, or they won't. The judge called a recess. The clock on the wall gave us 10 quiet minutes to reconsider who we were. In the hallway, Margaret leaned against the cold marble, eyes bright with a kind of life I hadn't seen in months. You did well, she said. I told the truth, I answered. That's rarer than it should be, she said, and for a second she was 10 again, brave around the edges. Lucas wandered into the hall alone. The air between us wasn't empty. It was crowded with every version of us that had ever shaken hands. He came close enough to count the sleepless nights in his face. You didn't have to say you cared, he said. No accusation, no gratitude, just a sentence that didn't know where to live. I meant it, I replied. It won't help me, he said, almost curious. It wasn't for you, I said, it was for me. He nodded once, as if filing the line away somewhere he'd never look again, then went back inside. When the judge returned, she spoke like weather, inevitable. There would be a formal arraignment. The preliminary findings supported charges of fraud and identity misuse. The accounts would remain frozen pending outcome, no grand declarations, just guardrails placed where the road had fooled us. We left quietly. Outside, the wind had shifted. Harbour air knows how to move around decisions. Margaret drove us home. We didn't talk much. I watched the trees thin into ocean, the sky pretending a blue it hadn't fully earned. When she pulled into the drive, she squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, Dad. Pride is dangerous, I said, half smiling. So is letting a wound fester, she replied. This is cleaner. She went inside to make tea. I stood on the porch steps and let the cold argue with my bones. That's when the grey sedan turned onto our street. Lucas cut the engine, but not the momentum. He climbed the steps 2 at a time, breath carving frost into the air. I didn't move. I'd been running a long time without taking a step. I was done now. You could still stop this, he said, hoarse. It's not mine to stop anymore, I said. It was never yours to start, he snarled. You owed me. You said this house was mine too. I said you had a home here, I corrected. I didn't say you could hollow it out. He looked past me into the house, into the rooms where he had once laughed. Something in him collapsed and reassembled as anger. You think the foundation makes you clean. You think putting a name on a charity absolves you of throwing me to wolves. The foundation isn't absolution, I said. It's direction. The first thing I've done with this pain that doesn't breed more. He stepped closer, close enough to smell the stale fear in him. Do you want me in jail, Arthur? I let the question hang until it lost some heat. I want you to stop taking from people who love you. I never took anything you didn't hand me, he said, words like ice thrown at a window. That was my failure, I said, and it ends here. Behind me, Margaret opened the door. Lucas, she said. Her voice did not tremble. You need to leave. He turned toward her, something wild crossing his face, then softening into a grief he didn't have the skill to hold. Maggie, No, she said. Not today. For a heartbeat, we were a tableau. 3 people who had once shared a table and now shared only a cliff. Lucas swallowed hard. You loved being needed, old man, he said to me, but the words were aimed at himself. You loved it so much you didn't notice it was the only thing keeping you alive. He wanted it to wound. It didn't. It kept me alive long enough to learn a better way, I said. He backed down 1 step, then another. You'll regret this, he whispered. I already regret the years I mistook pity for love, I said. The rest I can live with. He turned, staggered to the car, and sat there with his hands on the wheel like a man remembering how to pray. Then the engine coughed awake and he was gone. Taillights stitching a red line through Harborville's grey. I didn't watch him all the way down the road. I went inside. Margaret handed me a mug. We stood by the window and listened to the ocean draw a new breath. Frank called an hour later. "We're set for the arraignment," he said. 2 weeks. "Thank you," I said. My voice surprised me, steady, without effort. After I hung up, I took the folder labeled "The Eleanor Foundation" from the shelf and slid inside the single line I'd written the night before. Mercy isn't forgetting, it's remembering without surrendering. I pressed the folder shut like a seal. Night came early, the way it does in Maine when the year is still learning how to be warm. I stepped onto the back porch. The harbor was a dark animal breathing. Somewhere out there a bell buoy kept time. I closed my eyes and matched it. The story wasn't over, but the chase was. I could feel the house noticing, the way a body notices when a fever breaks. Not miracle, not relief, but the sudden absence of the wrong fire. Inside, Margaret set 2 plates on the table. The steam rose like a promise that didn't need words. I sat. I tasted everything. Tomorrow, there would be paperwork and phone calls and the next necessary step. Tonight, there was food and a daughter and a room no longer lying to itself. If there's a moment when justice arrives, it's not when the gavel falls. It's when you stop negotiating with the thing that's been drowning you and let the tide go out. I went to bed and slept the way the harbor sleeps, aware of the moon, unafraid of the morning. The morning after the hearing felt different, not lighter exactly, but rearranged. The house had its own kind of silence now, not empty, but earned. Sunlight crept through the blinds in long, patient lines, the kind Eleanor used to call honest light. Margaret was already awake, reading at the table with her coffee. When she looked up, there was no strain left in her eyes. "You slept," she said, surprised. "I did," I said. "Finally." She smiled. "It suits you." We spent the day quietly. She had taken a few days off work, said she needed to breathe somewhere that made sense. I let her. We cooked together for the first time in months, moving around the kitchen in the gentle choreography of people who have learned how to share silence without fear. At noon, Frank called. The arraignment had been scheduled. Lucas's bail hearing was set for the following week. He'd been charged formally with fraud and identity misuse, just as we expected. There would be negotiations, maybe a plea deal. "Are you all right with that?" Frank asked. "I'm all right with the truth being written down," I said. "Then that's enough," he replied. After we hung up, I stood at the window, watching the harbor shift from silver to deep green under the changing sky. The gulls were louder than usual, restless with spring. Margaret came beside me, following my gaze. "Do you think he'll go to jail?" "Probably for a while," I said. "Long enough to remember who he is." "Do you hate him?" I thought about it. "No, hate's just another form of dependence. I'm done with those." She nodded slowly. "I think Mom would have been proud of you. That one hit me right in the ribs, the kind of truth that hurts like kindness." "I hope so," I said. That afternoon, I walked to the foundation office for the first time. The town council had given us a small room above the library, a single desk, a window facing the water, and a smell of old books and salt. I set Eleanor's framed photo on the desk, beneath it a single envelope, the first grant request from the Harborville Clinic, asking for equipment funding. I signed the approval, the ink flowing smoother than I expected. It felt like exhaling after a long, stubborn breath. On my way home, people stopped me. Mrs. Reed from church pressed my hand, said, "We're proud of what you're doing, Arthur." Others nodded, awkward but kind. No one mentioned Lucas directly, though a few eyes carried the story. That's small towns, they never forget, but they learn to speak forgiveness in gestures. When I reached home, Margaret was tending the small garden Eleanor had planted decades ago. The soil still held the ghosts of marigolds and mint. "They'll bloom again," she said. "Give it a season." I joined her, kneeling beside the same patch of earth where we'd buried Eleanor's favorite rosebush. My knees complained, but my heart didn't. Together, we cleared the weeds, turned the dirt, planted new seedlings. It wasn't just gardening, it was ceremony. Afterward, we sat on the porch, mud on our hands, watching the harbor roll toward evening. The sky turned the same kind of gold Eleanor loved to chase with her camera. Margaret spoke first. "You know, I used to think forgiveness meant letting someone back in." "Doesn't," I said. "It just means you stop letting them live rent-free in your head." She smiled faintly. "That's a better deal." The wind picked up, bringing the scent of salt and pine. Somewhere far off, a bellbuoy rang. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. The world had resumed its pulse. The tide, the wind, the simple sound of plates in the sink. It all sounded like life starting over. As dusk settled, I walked to the back of the yard where Eleanor's old garden fence still stood. I dug a small hole and planted a sapling, an oak, sturdy and patient. The same way she used to describe faith. Margaret came up beside me, wiping her hands on her jeans. "What's this one for?" "For time," I said. "For the kind that heals slow but sure." She nodded, resting her head briefly on my shoulder. "Then it'll grow strong." The sun sank, spilling its last light across the harbor. The sapling stood in its shadow, thin but certain. As we went back inside, I paused at the door and looked once more toward the sea. The waves kept their rhythm, the kind that doesn't ask for applause, just witness. I thought of Eleanor, of Lucas, of all the moments that had carved me hollow just so something better could fit. And for the first time in years I whispered, not in prayer, but in gratitude, "We made it, my love. Maybe not clean, but whole enough." Spring returns to Harborville. The oak takes root, and for once, the house only remembers joy. If this story stayed in your heart, like the tide that always returns, subscribe and stay a while.